This is Deepal Parekh with Ravi Brahmat and Dr. Paul Wagner. We're former students of Dr. Wagner from Ethics and Leadership class. And today's focus is on inclusion and cost and benefit. So I wanted to ask Dr. Wagner a question to start with. What is a meta language, and what makes an accounting page a meta language of educational commitment?
Well, a meta language is a language that you use to talk about another language. For example, if we wanted to talk about Latin, there could be a phrase like "Suscipiat Dominus Sacrificium de Menos." That's a Latin sentence. And as we use English to talk about that Latin sentence, the English sentences that we use to talk about the Latin sentence are the meta language. They are about the other language. Now, when I talk about accounting and budgeting as being the meta language of educational commitment, what I mean by that is people can say all sorts of lofty things about how important education is to the country, how important education is to them, how important education is to their profession, that education has all these wonderful characteristics and all these benefits if people become educated. Well, you can talk like that all day long, but when it comes to, are you really committed to it? What does your budget say? And if your budget says we put more emphasis on money being spent on a new scoreboard for the football field, or on monies being spent for half a dozen new administrators when the previous year the school seemed to manage just perfectly. Money is being spent on staff to perhaps write grants rather than instructional staff to work in classrooms and decrease the number of students per classroom. Well, you're telling us something about what really matters to you. And one of the things we know in any big organization, and it happens in schools too, as soon as you make somebody some kind of an administrator, there's a tendency for them to want to have an assistant administrator. And as soon as that new person comes along as the assistant administrator, what they want to have is they want to have an assistant to the assistant administrator. And if those requests go through, what you find is that the budget is telling us that this organization is really about employing adults, and it is not about educating students. The idea of educating students becomes secondary. The primary task of employing adults. We have to be careful that we don't let that happen. So accounting, budget, that's the meta language. You want to know, set aside all the lofty talk of the school administrators. If you want to know that district or at that building is really committed to education, first thing to do is take a look at the budget and how are funds distributed. And is it all about putting classroom instruction at the center of it all, with everything else being secondary to it? For example, I can see that PE, I think, is a worthwhile expenditure in the public schools. Even back to the ancient Greeks, they told us good body, good mind. And people do read better, think better, talk better when you keep them physically active. So there ought to be time for physical exercise. And that I see as supporting the great conversation. Even though some might say, well, PE, physical education, that's really different than all the rest of those academic subjects. Not really, it lends support to it. But having 5 or 6 new assistants to the assistant, I'm not sure that produces benefits in the classroom. Having all sorts of special coaching days for teachers so that they can coach the kids in preparation for the next standardized exam, that's telling us this is all about employing adults. This really isn't about the education of the students, because no student is going to be a success in life because he can recognize the answer to question 16 as C. To be a success in life, he has to learn how to think. That's what should take place in our classrooms. What is the budget telling us about that commitment?
So piggybacking off the last conversation, you're right, because when you have too many of assistants, then you're busy being a manager or a boss because you got to manage those people rather than being the true leader. Wow.
Right.
Um, I do have a following question.
All right.
You write in the section that assault on inclusion is a consequence of lacking an attitude, the attitude of respect for others. You say this. You say that this lack of respect leads to bullying, sexism, and religious and ethnic intolerance. What do you exactly mean by that?
Well, first of all, let me repeat the line assault, um, assault on inclusion. And that is what I think happens when we see that there's bullying, sexism, intolerance for different ethnic or religious groups going on in our classrooms. If you're going to be committed to having inclusive, everybody, regardless of how, and while they're physically present during the conversation, they've also got to feel comfortable in evaluating what others are saying. That means if the most popular kids make some kind of a bold claim, that the least popular kid in the class can question that claim and say, I don't see how that really holds given the assumptions I think we've been starting with. And that smaller, less popular kid can feel comfortable raising that claim without being belittled by classmates, then you don't have the great conversation going on. There's an attitude that has to be developed for a great conversation to take place. And that attitude, as the psychologist Heron Wood in their new book, 2020 book called The Friendliest Wins, that attitude is respect. They call it friendliness, but it's respect, respecting everyone. It doesn't mean you like everyone the same, but it means you respect everyone and you want to hear what everyone has to say. You mentioned religion as one of the outcasts, oftentimes in a school setting. And that occurs for many reasons. Either you are in a situation where teachers are so terrified of talking about anything religious that indirectly they wind up imposing on the kids a sort of secularism or atheism. Well, that's not keeping the conversation open. If you have children from a small minority group in an area where there's a majority community centered around a certain religion, if the classroom becomes tolerant of things common to that religion and intolerant of the ones from the minority group, again, you have an assault. It's really an assault on the inclusiveness that we ought to find. One of the wonderful schools that I have seen when I was at Harvard many, many years ago, my son was going to a public grammar school in which approximately 90% of the students at that school were Jewish. And there were so many Jewish students at the school that the public school, even gave Jewish holidays off. And they said if we didn't, we'd have 90% of our kids gone on the days of the Jewish holidays. Jewish holidays off. In addition, in the school, you could get a kosher diet. Now, what that means is a rabbi had to come into that school, that public school's kitchen, and bless it and do certain things that rabbis do in kitchens to make sure that kosher food could properly be prepared for those students who wanted to be on the kosher diet. Now, in that school district, which had 100 years ago been overwhelmingly Christian and probably more Catholic than anything else. That school district was now overwhelmingly Jewish. Public school, and I told you what they did in the public school. Christmas time would come up, and you had roughly 7% of the population in that district was still Christian, and you had 3% being other. They would have a Christmas program. And so you would have all these Jewish kids and the other kids standing up on the stage and singing Away in a Manger or something about Bethlehem or whatever. And these were largely Jewish kids. But what the school had really achieved was tolerance isn't telling other people you're offended by them and you want them to be quiet about everything they believe. But tolerance is a willingness to let other people flourish with their beliefs. So the Christian community, only 7% of them, a single person, could have gone to there's some legal group that would have said, look, this is a public school and these are religious practices going on, and they could have sued and that would have shut things down. But that would have been disheartening to 90% of that community. And in response, the 90% took it upon themselves to do what they could to respect and honor those who were tolerant of them. There's another area in Missouri. In central Missouri, there's a town called Herman, and it's surrounded by 6 other little villages, and they're all Bavarian German heritage, and they've been there for 100 and some years. The public school is called St. Francis. And at this little public school, they even get the St. Francis holiday off. There's some kind of a holiday for the different saints. They get St. Francis holiday off at the public school. And again, the school is overwhelmingly Catholic. It's a Bavarian German Catholic community going back more than 100 years. But they're also very sensitive to ensuring that everybody else who may have moved into the area, which is still a very small minority, is comfortable with what they're trying to do to respect the conventions of everyone. There are kids who feel threatened if they, particularly in elementary school or junior high, if they raise a question about, well, did God play a role in something? Teachers shouldn't run from that, but they also shouldn't proselytize for their religion, because that wouldn't be right either. But a teacher can handle it very easily by honoring the student's question, saying, John, it's an interesting question. But what it makes me think about, and then you move to another topic without quite getting into a discussion of whatever it is that Johnny brought up, because it was going to have religious overtones that may be difficult for a teacher to handle. And we don't want to take that risk, not because we're frightened of keeping an open classroom to all questions, but because it may be difficult to manage as respectfully and gently and as we might desire. So the teacher can let Johnny know that she takes his question very seriously. She does her acting job of seeming to pause and reflect on it, but then moves on to something else, as though something had just come to mind, and class moves on very nicely. In the case of classroom bullies, there's just no tolerance for classroom bullies, period. And the teacher every teacher should think of herself or himself as a leader. That leader in that classroom should never bully students. It's not true because I said so. It's not true because here's a reason, understanding why it's not true. But that teacher should also be somebody that everyone recognizes would not bully any child. And the teacher, by being the leader, is also a role model of proper leadership. Leaders don't boss, they lead. They don't bully, they explain. They offer help. They take the time to reflect about something. They're not abrupt with an earnest question asked by a student. Now, if the student's just harassing the teacher with silly questions, that's one thing. But if a student is asking genuine questions and he's confused about something, the teacher needs to respond to that with just as much genuineness and her reflective composure that she exhibits to that student into all the class. To different racial groups or ethnic groups and so on. There's so much to learn from different ethnic groups. And one of the worst things that can happen in a classroom is that if people have become so intolerant that they are offended by any accidental comment by anybody, that even children are afraid to speak out. And I've had my college students say at times that they're intimidated to speak out in some classes that they're in, and not because of the professor, but because they're afraid of their fellow students and how their fellow students might react to them if they've said something that's politically incorrect. Well, when students become afraid of one another and they become afraid to say something that may be taken as politically incorrect, what you're going to do is build racism. You're going to build just the opposite of what we want to have in terms of ethnic diversity and so on, because what will happen, the students will seek out others that they already know think just like them. And those are the people they'll talk to during lunch, after school, or whatever. And those opportunities to learn from kids from different backgrounds, that'll never happen because everyone is afraid of being challenged for being insensitive or whatever. There's a phrase, a very ordinary phrase that has been used forever in life, and it might be a phrase like this: "You people." So we might ask a question of the teachers over at a nearby school district. Well, how are you people handling the state standardized testing this year? Now notice that sentence could be used probably without anyone taking offense, I would hope. An 11-year-old hearing adults use a sentence like that and having no problem with it might ask a question about, well, why do you kids on the wrong side of the tracks, and I feel comfortable saying that because I grew up near a railroad freight yard of 12 railroad lines, and just a block over this way, 6 passenger lines of trains. I was on the wrong side of 2 sets of tracks. So I know what it's like to be on the wrong set of tracks. But I liked it when people asked me what it was like to grow up poor and on the wrong side of the tracks, because I knew something about that and I could share that with them. And I wanted to know what it was like for them to grow up on the right side of the tracks and what life was like over there. There was so much that we had to share with each other if we'd only listen and if we'd ask each other questions. So I really fear when I talk about the assault on inclusiveness, when students have made other students fearful of saying the wrong thing. I said, you people, and all of a sudden it sounds like I've said something that was an attack on others, and I wasn't. I'm 11 years old, and I'm just trying to ask, how do you guys on the other side of the tracks see the world? When I was working on my PhD to make a few bucks on the side, I taught for a community college, and the classes I taught, in addition to my regular work at the university, the classes I taught were at a prison. And at this prison, 2/3 of the inmates were largely African American, and 1/3 they had a few Latinos, but mostly they were Anglos. And one thing that they all had in common, for the most part, state prison, they were poor. They were poor people. Whether they came from the inner cities, they were poor. Whether they came from the rural parts of the state, they were poor. But they didn't necessarily recognize that they had that in common, and that other than their racial backgrounds and so on, they had much to share in common, and they had differences that they could have shared with one another. And yet there was a fair amount of divisiveness in prisons between racial groups. But in the classes that I taught, I was so delighted that after class, oftentimes, most of the class would stay around, and I was able to get them to talk to each other about how they saw the different groups and growing up in rural Missouri as opposed to St. Louis or Kansas City. And I think they appreciate getting to learn a lot from one another rather than just keeping silent and then going apart and talking in prejudicial ways about those others that they never really got to learn much about. So when I use that phrase, an assault on inclusiveness, I really mean to use a strong word like assault, because what happens is we drive ourselves out of the great conversation when we intimidate one another. And that's, any intimidation is a form of bullying.
Thank you. You just reminded me of my schooling in India, because very well said the way you said it. I grew up in India, and I went to public schools in India. And just like what you said, we were allowed to celebrate any holiday that brought people together. So we celebrated Diwali, we celebrated Eid, we celebrated Christmas, we celebrated Buddhist holidays, like any. So we had a lot of holidays. We were not off from school, but we celebrated at school, which was a very good learning experience, because whichever holiday it was, our teachers spotlighted those particular groups. So they taught us why they celebrate whatever holiday, what's the purpose, what is the significance to them and their family. So it really enlightened all of us, because we didn't just saw it on TV, or we didn't just hear it on radio, but we actually saw and talked to the people who celebrated or who had attach meanings and values to the event.
One of the things that goes along with that, if you're going to have tolerance for inclusiveness for real, is the other guy, keep this line in mind, the other guy has a right to be wrong. And this is what I mean by that. In Europe, for example, back during the the Middle Ages and beyond, the post-Renaissance period and so on, many wars were fought largely over religious differences. And that has occurred in other parts of the world too. But you could take Paris, the Parisians and the Parisian Catholics invited the Huguenots into Paris and say, okay, we're done fighting, let's all make peace and so on. Once they got the Huguenot army into Paris, they closed the gates and then they slaughtered them. Yeah, that was obviously horrible. Today, I think that lots of people that I know of in various religions the Presbyterian can say to the Baptist, both of them coming from Anglo traditions in Europe, but had been hateful 100 so years ago, but they can say to one another, I don't agree with that approach. Presbyterians, I think, believe like John Calvin did, and they think we have no free will and we're predestined. And so you take some other Christian group that thinks you do have free will. And I can imagine them having very enriched discussions with each other. It doesn't mean they have to agree. It doesn't mean they certainly don't have to say, well, there's truth in all religions, because if that's the case, then that means there's no truth in any of the religions. The reason to discuss anything is to try to reach for our approximation of truth. And the only way we can do that is by talking about it. And people that have very different angles on it can cause us to pause and reflect more about it. It doesn't mean we have to agree with them. Say, well, you're right too, and I'm right. No, it doesn't have to be that way. You could say, well, I'm still not convinced by what you have to say, but I really appreciate your explaining it to me. Certainly, I'll think about it. I'm not sure I'm going to change my views. Sometimes we do change our views after talking to somebody else, but we'll never change our views if we're hostile to one another when any conversation comes up that we're somehow afraid to object to the conclusion. Not object to the person, but object to the conclusion. I like to think of explanations and arguments not in the sense of a quibble, but arguments in the sense of starting with premises and leading through a chain of reasoning to a conclusion. I like to think in terms of explanations and arguments as being like athletes that are trained to put into the ring. And the person who trains the athlete, their ego shouldn't be at stake once the argument or the explanation is put into the ring for public view and evaluation. Once I've done the best job I can to train my explanation or my argument, then it's got to make its own way in the ring of public review. And so in that ring of public review, people have at it. They should ask difficult questions about it. And they don't have to agree with, oh, yes, you have, that's your truth and that's okay. No, I don't want my truth. I really want to get at anything that comes close to approximating truth, whether it's in physics or biochemistry, religion, morality. I think I'm better for it when I get closer to something that approximates truth, something that isn't just a part of my ego at the moment or my personality. So the explanations, the arguments got to make their own way. And we all have to be respectful of the trainers that created the explanations and the arguments. But once those arguments are put in the public ring for review, they've got to make their own way. And that means responding to difficult questions and challenges and restructuring arguments and reconsidering certain explanations, patching them up as they need be, sometimes giving them up altogether. So
continuing with that thought, when you say that the person that's training the athlete, let's put in faculty or teachers, right? If that teacher is there teaching the students, they're giving their best, and then the students are evaluated or assessed on their knowledge. So what are your thoughts, or what does it mean to assess education? Or are assessment and evaluation different from one another, or are they the
very
same?
different from one another. Anyone can look them up in a technical dictionary, not on the quickie computer dictionaries that we have on the computers that give us at best a ballpark idea of the term. But when you look at technical dictionaries or an encyclopedia to look up the words assessment and evaluation, you'll see that they're very, very different. The word assessment, in fact, I'll give you a wonderful thesaurus that's a quick read on these kinds of matters. Michael Scriven, who was president of the American Evaluation Association, Michael Scriven, in his book, The Evaluation Thesaurus, and he's written many books, but that book, The Evaluation Thesaurus, should be on every educator's desk. He explains that what an assessment is just taking quantitative notice of what seems to be evident. So for example, if you ask me what time is it, I might look at my watch and I might tell you it's 2:30. That's just an assessment. You're going on a trip, you're going on a car trip, and you start on your trip at 12 o'clock and you're driving along, and then somebody that's with you says, okay, so what time is it now? You say 2:30. You made an assessment. And then that person says, and we started at 12, right? Well, yes, and that was an assessment too. And they might say, now where are we? And you say, well, we're just outside of Boston. And they say, ooh, we're making good time. We're making good time, quote and unquote, is an evaluation. And Scriven says, keep in mind, in that word evaluation, it's almost like we have value in the middle of the word to remind us that when we make an evaluation, we're going beyond just observing the data as we do in an assessment. And now we're making a further claim about whether or not what we've observed is good or bad in light of whatever purposes we have in mind. At one time I had to learn some Latin when I was a grade school kid. And I learned it, and I can still produce it today. But I don't know what it means. And I didn't know what it meant then. And the people who demanded that I memorize this Latin could assess whether or not I knew it or not, because they could just ask me to repeat it, and I could repeat it. They could have given me a multiple choice test, given me a stem in Latin, and see if I can produce the next word out of 4 alternatives that they have put before me. And if I get it right, they're making an assessment. Now, is that good that I'm able to produce by memory, by rote memory, certain Latin passages? I'm not sure. I see that as being something I would evaluate as good. It's never made any important difference to me as a professor, other than when I use it as an example in this situation. An evaluation is when we're saying, here is something that is good, or here is something that is bad. I think memorizing the Latin that I memorized, and for no subsequent purpose, was probably a waste of my time. And my time could have been much better spent being asked a question about something difficult, and then asked to write about how I would explain it. My oldest daughter, when we were out in Boston, I went to a reception in the psychology department for a visiting scholar, and he was a specialist in cognitive science, and that was all the thing in those days. And I didn't know if I was going to be able to come because I had to go pick up my daughter from high school, and my friends in the faculty had said, yes, you can bring her. How old is she? And I said, well, she's a freshman in high school. I said, go ahead and bring her. So she and I are there. Everyone is surrounding the speaker, but there's this old man that I knew kind of over in the corner, and no one's talking to him. His name was Fred. You all would know him as B.F. Skinner. And so I said, let's go over and talk to Fred. And so we did. And Fred, B.F. Skinner, very nice gentleman. Everyone always remarked on what a pleasant fellow he was. He asked my daughter, so what grade are you in? What are you doing in school? How is school going? And so on. She told him she had this speech she had to memorize, and it was about 3 paragraphs long. And so he told her to have your daddy run off about 25 copies of it, and then get some whiteout. Tells you how long ago that was. Have your daddy get some whiteout, and then white out on the first page maybe 4 or 5 words. Second page, 7 or 8 words, but different words than on the first page. The next page, maybe 15 words, and go all the way through to 25 pages until on the 25th page, there's only 2 or 3 pages or words left on the page. And he said, read through that a few times and you'll have memorized your speech. And she did. And she was so happy because that worked so well. Now, B.F. Skinner, and I'm no behaviorist, but B.F. Skinner did a pretty good job of coming up with some great engineering tools for doing something like memorizing a speech. It was funny when she went off to college. She came back at Thanksgiving time from her first year in college, and she had taken a psychology course. And she was so delighted when she saw me. And she said, Dad, did you know that old guy you knew called Fred? Did you know he's famous? I said, yes, honey. And if you recall, at the time I told you, far more significant in your memory will not be that he gave you a trick for remembering that speech, but that the guy who taught you that trick is a master of such tricks. And she was pretty impressed. And I said, I told you at the time he was famous. And she said, I thought he was just some old guy that you knew. In any case, there was a trick that Skinner had come up with. It worked very well. We could assess that it worked well. And my daughter would evaluate that trick very highly as a first-rate engineering tool for memorizing what you have to memorize.
Well, that was really interesting. And does your daughter still recall that event, like now?
Oh, yeah. Well, you know, she was amazed later on when she was about to graduate. She said, you know, that Skinner guy's name is in a number of books that I've had in classes. And I said, yes, honey, I'm not surprised at that. He's pretty famous.
So, Dr. Wagner, that concludes our prompt or focus for today. But I do want to request, say something in Latin then.
Let's see. Gloria Patria, Filio et Spiritus Sanctus, et nunc et semper in saecula saeculorum.
Okay, that was more than something. What does that mean?
It means, in a sense, glory to the heavens.
Oh, okay. So while you were, when you
I can
said
say namaste,
namaste in Sanskrit,
and that means, if I've got it right, that means the light in me sees the light in you. Is that right?
yes, I bow down to the light in you. That's what it means.
So I know more about that than I do about that Latin stuff.
No, but when you said that you knew Latin, I started translating on here, and I was trying to say, I look forward to the next call. So it's expecto. I'm not even gonna try too hard.
Okay.